We'll tell you any shit you want to hear.
Multi-armed deities.
Twisted and gyrated in provocative and sensual fashion.
There is no future.
So why not just burn the whole fucking thing down?
People are so evil.
I wish I could find a Hitler of today and go kill him.
What a time to be alive.
Welcome to the Nostalgia Trap AM/FM. This podcast is produced by robot historians in the near future, working in an abandoned mine shaft deep beneath the surface of a destroyed planet. Through space and time, the robots collect recordings of various humans attempting to make sense of a rapidly collapsing political and social situation, as the human disease unleashed its final spasms of cruelty and death. From our future robot perspective, sometimes it feels like the whole of humanity was trapped, with no way out, collectively waiting to be drowned in a river of blood. This episode is sponsored by Taco Bell, featuring the new Volcano Crispy Chicken Chips.
Yo quiero Taco Bell.
Please enjoy.
Suck a hippo's cock. Suck a honey badger's try to...
All right, so the topic is false flags. Go. Yeah, so today we're talking about, or at least try to talk about, the topic of false flag attacks, which has become, something of a, it's weird because it's something I feel like, Justin, you and I used to talk about a lot, just, in Saturday night conversation type stuff, but...
Let's not embarrass ourselves here.
Right, but it's become, something of a more into the mainstream. I think that maybe the touchstone of the last few weeks has been Donald Trump, who's currently our president. I can't really say it without laughing every time I say it, but he kind of like brought up false flags with regards to the Jewish cemeteries that have been vandalized, and literally like within the context of the investigation, said to a number of government officials that it's possible that these attacks are staged by Jewish people as a way to make it appear that there's more anti-Semitism in the society than there is. I guess that's what he means by that. But Justin, you and I have talked about false flags for a while. Where are you with with what it means that this kind of idea is now commonplace?
Well, I think the most obvious thing to say is a narrative and a concept which is sort of associated with the far right. It's not an idea that's expressed with any enthusiasm or emphasis by people on the left, historically or in the present moment, has found its way into the sort of central corridors of power. And we have a whole crew of people and a whole slew of media that are now kind of openly talking about the presence of false flags, etc. I think in some ways it's good, because it surfaces a lot of like the actual ideological tension in our culture that is kind of disappears under like the liberal consensus and floated both under Obama and under Bush. And I think you referred to us talking on Saturday nights earlier. Yeah, it's a little embarrassing at the same time. I'm glad we had this training because we've been talking and reading and watching Alex Jones for 10 or 15 years now. Yeah. Which is amazing to be able to say. And that I remember
in Waking Life, the Richard Linklater animated film.
I don't know about you, but I'm concerned with what's happening in this world. I'm concerned with the structure. I'm concerned with the systems of control. Those that control my life and those that seek to control it even more. I want freedom. That's what I want. And that's what you should want. We have got to realize that we're being conditioned on a mass scale. Start challenging this corporate slave state. The 21st century is going to be a new century. Not the century of slavery, not the century of lies and issues of no significance, and classism and statism and all the rest of the modes of control. What a bunch of garbage, liberal, Democrat, conservative, Republican. It's all there to control you, two sides of the same coin. Two management teams bidding for control, the CEO job of Slavery Incorporated. Resistance is not futile. We're going to win this thing. Humankind is too good. We're not a bunch of underachievers. We're going to stand up and we're going to be human beings. We're going to get fired up about the real things, the things that matter. Creativity and the dynamic human spirit that refuses to submit.
Alex Jones is only 43 years old now in 2017. He was like in his 20s when that came out. He's been around for a long time.
Yeah, he has. And one thing that
it's kind of incredible how influential he's become.
Yep. And when people talk about like false flags, it's all part of sort of conspiracy theory. And you can pull out quotes when you Google it from news sources that sort of say stuff like, this kind of stuff is usually kept to the dark and mad fringes of the internet.
Yeah.
And in some ways, that's very misleading because he's had one of the leading news websites for 10 or 15 years and, regularly got more unique clicks than most of all the corporate CNN, Fox News stuff combined. And the New York Times reported on that well before Trump even seriously ran for president in this last election cycle.
I used to see Infowars.com and PrisonPlanet.com graffiti in the bathrooms at CUNY at different campuses and think to myself, oh, this is some sort of like underground thing, but it's become much more mainstream. I mean, when I think about conspiracy theories, I don't necessarily like think they're they're the like hallmark entirely of the right. Like I feel like, I mean, the classic false flag attack is what the Reichstag fire, which is during the beginnings of Hitler taking power in Germany, which I think has been confirmed was a literal false flag, right? I mean, I don't know the
what
details
I know
of
is I think enough mainstream historians,
kind
of will admit that there's this possibility that it was. In other words, like it's up for serious debate.
Which means that a false flag attack is like a central element of one of the most destructive regimes in the 20th century and one of the most signal events of the whole last couple hundred years, which is kind of incredible. It tells you like that kind of like false flag conspiracy idea, whatever it is, it's able to turn history.
Yeah. Well, and that's interesting that it has this role in history, and I want to speak to that in just a second. But speaking to what you just said, I found another article in this sentence says, false flags have been used throughout history, although by their very nature, it is seldom clear whether specific acts were part of a false flag operation or not.
Wow.
And it's like, well, that's a strange sentence.
Seldom clear. What's that from?
I'll figure it out later.
Yeah. We'll footnote all of this.
Yeah. It's a little screenshot there.
We gotta find a way to footnote a podcast. That's a tricky idea. But yeah, when I think about like American conspiracy theories, I mean it's weird because it's like we've talked about this before, and like Don DeLillo has probably written about it, but like the idea of like the JFK assassination and for me, you can't talk about JFK without the Lee Harvey Oswald assassination that happened just a couple days later.
Madness and hate erupt anew in Dallas as President Kennedy's accused assassin is shot down himself during a jail transfer. There's an ominous symbol in Lee Harvey Oswald's murder weapon as he is taken to the city jail basement where an armored car is to move him to a maximum security cell. Oswald walks his last mile. His assailant moves in from the right.
There is Lee Oswald. He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
Like it's like, please don't put two and two together here, America. But like that, I mean, that is where, and I know writers have touched on this subject before. The idea that the JFK assassination is a moment where Americans themselves began to kind of like doubt the fabric of reality, or that the consensus reality that Americans were living in begins to fall apart.
Agreed.
And that's something that people have talked a lot about with regard to the Trump moment, is that Americans don't really live in the same reality at all. And like I think a lot of people talk about it in terms of like the internet and social media bubbles and East Coast bubbles and all that stuff, but there is this angle on it that's interesting about the JFK thing, because it's like it launched us into this part where like there's like murder and the deep state and like shit like that that you can almost begin to believe anything.
I agree. Well, I think to me that says two things very important. First of all, this idea that we're post-truth, we've never been truth. In other words, there is no post-truth because there was never a time of truth.
Right.
And at a minimum, the Kennedy assassination and the Warren Commission, and then the subsequent assassination committees of the 70s, all point towards, at a minimum, a disagreement about truths regarding the Kennedy assassination, which is probably the most prolific political event of the 20th century, or one of them.
Yeah.
Right? And so this idea that we disagree about the basic structure of reality has always been there. It's in fact a part of the deep psychology behind American politics. And you can also point to the kind of idea that we have a partisan frame of knowledge that's at work, or partisan frames of knowledge, but also in a country that fought a civil war, in a country in which the lost cause has been elevated into a civil religion, partisanship is religious, and this idea that what I think is interesting,
and partisanship itself becomes these basically frames of reality.
That's right.
Yeah,
and I think what false flag does is it marks a kind of ripple in the fabric of partisan knowledge on both sides. It marks the ideological limit of what some people can't believe and what other people can believe.
Right.
And so it actually corresponds to some of the deeper emotional truths that drive the religiousness of partisanship.
Yeah.
And exposes sort of the boundaries of community, the boundaries of political community, and those boundaries.
The boundaries of community when everyone's living in their own hysterical reality,
and always have.
Yeah.
And so
right. Well, that's a point you've made a lot, which is you really resist this kind of big national identity stuff. Which I think I'm as a historian, I often get seduced by kind of big ideas about what America is, etc. And I love how you're always kind of shitting on that because you're I'll bring up something at Walt Whitman or something like that, and you'll be remind me that Walt Whitman is this repulsive militant nationalist.
America, center of equal daughters, equal sons, all alike and good.
Mein Führer, Kameraden.
Someone should Google his politics in the Mexican War. Maybe he was an imperialist in his own fashion. But I would have never shit on Walt Whitman.
I know, of course not. And I brought up Walt Whitman just to bring up the idea of nationalism and the idea of singing America and things like that. You often are kind of really really resistant to the idea that we live in a kind of coherent national place, and that kind of goes along with this idea we're talking about now of people living in their own realities, right? And that always have been.
Yeah,
and that there never was one reality. I think of the reality of the founding fathers in that era that people romanticize. There are I can think of multi realities happening.
Sure.
At that, I mean, from slaves living in the rice plantations in South Carolina. What's their reality at that moment compared to these founding fathers we talk about the most? I mean, there's so many other examples. But
I agree, and I'm glad
it's always been that way, right?
I'm really glad you bring that up because there's a racial and class politics to this as well,
right?
And so once you accept the idea that from the perspective of an enslaved person, this idea that there's multiple realities from the get-go is very easy to accept, and that the interpretation of history looks a lot differently. Frederick Douglass's speech, what to the slave is the 4th of July.
Right,
he's
right.
Did you bring me here as a mockery to humiliate and embarrass me?
Yeah.
Because I'm talking about slavery here in 1852 when you invite me to celebrate your Independence Day. And, that contradiction, that flip, that limit, that boundary of the community that's expressed there, I think, gets expressed also in terms of the threat of conspiracy on all sides. So, for example, this idea that the slave rebellion was always about to happen, in the antebellum period, or the idea that there was conspiracy theories around John Brown, and who funded him and what was his real intentions, you can see that these ideas of the truth of conspiracy and of false flags is often emotional as opposed to factual.
Right.
And it just goes back to one other thing there, which is also that the thing that I truly believe about the history and the genealogy of conspiracy and false flags is that throughout all of time, including right now, the thing that's going to turn the narrative, so to speak, or these competing narratives, is power, not facts.
Right.
So this liberal idea that you can defeat the army of trolls and you can defeat the specter of the post-truth world by just continually presenting people with facts is anomalous and is in defiance of what we've learned about religion and history.
Right.
Politics is religion. It is not reasonable. And who controls the narrative controls it through power as much as anything else. And in that sense, I'm very glad for this moment because it exposes a truth behind politics, which is, if you want to combat Pizzagate and you want to combat anti-Semitic attacks by Jews on themselves.
Right.
If you want to combat that whole string of things, you're not going to have success convincing someone, persuading them with like a 5-paragraph essay. You're going to have to take action politically and get and maintain and control power.
Well, the way you're talking, I mean, it makes it sound like the people that are talking about false flags, the Alex Jones, alt-right, Trump himself, up to the president, that these people actually like have a savvy understanding of what politics is. Like they understand the kind of like, because I know you always talk about, I mean, the buzzword for a long time in academia, and I don't know if it still is like affect. But the idea that there's like feelings underlying a lot of these politics and like deep psychological shit. I mean, this is stuff that like Zizek talks about, or I know there are a million other theorists. He's the kind of like pop touchstone, but like either way, that idea that people's politics come from a really, really deep, weird place that are not necessarily rooted in rational thought and not necessarily rooted in kind of like study, and that's what kind of like gives the like lie to a lot of the academic project, and maybe kind of explains why so many academic people, East Coast liberals, whatever you want to call them, were kind of like blindsided by the Trump thing. Is because they were thinking with their heads and they should have been thinking with something else. I mean, Colbert kind of like Stephen Colbert like used to talk about this truthiness or this gut thing, and it's like it seems like the election in 2016 turned on the gut in a lot of ways and didn't turn on the mind, and it's driving quote unquote smart people crazy because they're like, this shouldn't be.
Right. Well, I think the difference there too is whatever class or education politics are going to be thrown in there. I'm not sure if religion is the divide, but I do think that religion is the framework for understanding this. So, can you go around and unconvert someone who has deep faith in one of those monotheistic religions? Not really. Those people practice those faiths and have those beliefs for reasons that are like way, way beyond reason, rationality, and education, etc. Those are deep affective relationships to the world. That is actually what we have to understand, is that politics for a long time, especially on the right, has become coextensive with religion. The Lost Cause is a civil religion. Those lynchings were, religious sacrificial rituals. The way to understand these divides is to look also at, the difference between the East Coast liberal and the Midwestern Catholic is a profound belief in God and a belief in the sacredness of a text and a sacred interpretation of a text. And if you look at that relationship to those texts, I'm not saying it's a one-to-one correspondence, but if you take sacred text literally, or you really believe there's deep truth in that text for no other reason than faith, the idea that you can become the idea that you can understand conspiracy narratives or false flag narratives in a way that's much different from someone who doesn't have that deep embodied psychological relationship to a sacred text, it's that to me marks out a very important distinction. If you don't have that relationship to text, you're starting from a point of view that will never be able to understand what's happened, and you certainly will not have predictive power about what's to come.
It sounds like the best politicians then are going to be like they practice like an occult magic, which is in a way like some kind of like mind control or control of like what's underneath, and false flag attacks can be like some sort of like weapon within that kind of politician's arsenal. Is like the false flag attack, and I'm thinking about like the Gulf of Tonkin incident with Lyndon Johnson and the beginnings of the Vietnam War.
Good point.
Right, and like I mean that's a false flag in the sense that, and what I mean by that is it was an attack that may or may not have happened. I mean, I've studied a lot of it. I mean, the elements of it happened, and elements of it did not. But either way, the Lyndon Johnson administration, Lyndon Johnson himself, like sold it as a really, really intense, unprovoked, aggressive attack from the North Vietnamese, requiring a military response that turned into the Vietnam War, turned into like hundreds of thousands of American troops. So it's like it was manipulated 100%. And I mean, I think I'm comfortable saying it was aggression by the Americans that was provoked. Whatever happened there was not what the Johnson administration presented it as. So it's like, these things turn history. Well, I mean, these things have power, and in this way, like Johnson is like a really savvy guy because he's getting what he wants right here.
I think Gulf of Tonkin is a great false flag because we've talked about these other, like the anti-Semitic...
A false flag greatest hit. And the award for Best False Flag Attack goes to the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This is the first award for director Lyndon Johnson and producer Robert McNamara. It's amazing what these men achieved working with a budget of only 3 million dead Vietnamese people. Give it up, everyone.
Yeah, and the reason is because technically, literally, the definition of false flag is, it's an attack by another country on a country.
Right.
It's a pretext.
Yeah. You're blaming. Yeah.
So there's two things that work there. One is this idea of the pretext. So this idea that like, well, do you believe that people in power are interested in money enough? Because I mean, Vietnam made a lot of people a lot of money, and that's kind of the screen that I see a lot of these wars that started under auspicious or suspicious circumstances. Is that these are
wars for capitalism.
Yep.
In one way or another, like either direct material capitalism or the ideological landscape of capitalism, and keeping it secure.
That's right. So look at settler colonialism. All you have to understand is, okay, well, they cleansed the continent of indigenous peoples for land and for money, primitive accumulation. And we're really, in Vietnam and in settler colonialism, we're really ready to believe, well, people, whether they provoke the attack or not, whether there's a lie at the beginning or not, people are willing to believe that other people will wipe out populations or attack populations for money, for profit, for power. Like that's an acceptable thing. The next step, and this is where people get really uncomfortable with false flag, and I think this is an important point to emphasize because the backstory to this is class politics.
Yeah.
Is that people get really uncomfortable thinking, well, nationalism must reveal something very true about our community, that our community is whole, because members of the community who are in positions of power to profit by an attack on the community would not do so on the basis of being an identifying member of that community. So in other words, the thing that's super uncomfortable about these theories of, and this plays into 9/11 and Sandy Hook. Both of those are big false flag attacks for Alex Jones. But I think you can analyze them a little bit differently. But I'll pause on that. Just to say that there's an idea of political incest. In other words, there has to be a moral, political, and economic prohibition against a group of people in power who are willing to kill their own citizens or willing to kill other people in their community in order to set in motion a chain of events that will make them more powerful, that will make them and their friends more wealthy.
Right.
People don't want to believe that. And I think that if you could just point to one true false flag, whatever it would be, if you can think about like a Reichstag fire, if you can believe it about the Nazis, to me, the whole idea of what happened during World War II with all those countries, Europe and the United States, what was happening in those countries and the way that populations were contained and controlled and mobilized and activated and set against one another. To me, that's not the exception. It proves a rule of the modern era. It's a rule of political modernity. I think some of us should contemplate what it means to just toy with the idea that there is this political incest, that the groups of people in power are, at a minimum, morally, psychologically okay with this. And the reason I related back to class.
Yeah. So, okay, just to wrap up what you're saying right here is that like a lot of people would say, I can't possibly believe in a 9/11 conspiracy or that, quote unquote, Bush planned 9/11 or anything because I can't believe that Americans, Bush and his people would be capable morally of killing so many Americans just to expand their power. I couldn't possibly believe that's true. I mean, for me, that's not the reason to dismiss 9/11 conspiracy theories because it's like, well, I think they are. I think I'm pretty comfortable thinking that people at that level of power, and particularly the people that surrounding Bush, are definitely capable of those kinds of things. That wouldn't be why I would disbelieve. And I'm not like a huge 9/11 truther or anything, but like that's definitely not a reason to dismiss the conspiracies as far as I'm concerned.
This deeper thing we're talking about. I think, in other words, that
don't say that these people aren't killers. They are killers.
That's right.
Like 100%.
That's right.
And even Obama is a killer. And like, do I think Obama killed a bunch of kids at Sandy Hook or faked the thing at Sandy Hook and so that he could do gun control? Obviously not. Like that the idea seems ridiculous to me. But that's the reality I'm living in, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know when you look at these YouTube videos of these fucking people that are really believe in the Sandy Hook conspiracy.
Sandy Hook is a synthetic, completely fake, with actors, in my view, manufactured. I couldn't believe it at first. I knew they had actors there, clearly, but I thought they killed some real kids.
They don't just kind of believe in it. They really believe in it. And when you talk about religious, I think that's the element to bring up, because they are wild-eyed believers, man. And like they anything you would say to them wouldn't disprove anything to them. In other words, like they're like going up to someone and saying like, "Oh, did you know that, you know, the Noah's Ark could have never happened because it's biologically and physically impossible to build a ship that would contain every, you know, species, two of every species." And people that believe it that's meaningless to say that to them. You know, like you're not really accomplishing anything, and you're never going to convince them. And that's true of the Sandy Hook believers too. And what's scary to me is it's true of like apparently a good portion of the country is in a reality that I look at as like they're believing really psychotic shit, like really off. But that's true of like, I mean, there are so many things that, I mean, and the internet is maybe just only, it revealed it and exploded it, that like people, whether it be a diet fad or a medical thing, they're in it and they believe it, and that's that. And you've seen that be almost like a defining element of American culture for a long time.
Yeah, well, and I think if you look at the planet today, and I know we're going to talk about, you know, climate change a little bit later.
Yeah.
I think the defining feature of, you know, Homo sapien sapien is that she is a religious animal. And, you know, if you go back to some of these believers, there is clearly a racial and gender politics to it. So maybe me staying on the word "he" does make sense.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah. What are those gender and racial elements?
InfoWars is, you know, they're advertising male supplement pills on the front page of InfoWars. In other words, like Alex Jones is making money having men thinking about their erections.
Yeah.
As they're reading, you know, Pizzagate.
You don't have to have an advanced humanities degree to unpack that, right?
Right.
And I mean, they sell stuff that's, I mean, you know, Joe Rogan is another example, and Joe Rogan is you know, in some ways a different animal than Alex Jones, but in some ways, you know, appealing to the same kind of audience. I think that maybe Joe Rogan's audience skews a little younger, but either way, it's definitely hyper masculine.
I think it says a lot about masculinity, and that's why I'm kind of interested in the Sandy Hook thing. I don't like talking or thinking or reading about the Sandy Hook thing.
Yeah.
But the dude who did it.
Well, it's probably one of the more disturbing things that's happened out of a probably a 15-year period of incredibly disturbing things. Sandy Hook's one of the most disturbing.
Yeah. And, you know, to me, there's a refusal to believe. In other words, like, to me, the racial and gender politics is really front and center. I don't think many people of color or women go to Alex Jones's website. I really don't. And I don't think that many of them believe that Sandy Hook was faked. It's not a narrative that produces currency. You know, in other words, it's a religious narrative for a lot of white men and probably some white women.
Yeah.
But mostly white men. I would love to see the data on that in some way.
Yeah,
but,
me
you know,
too.
But so I say that with speculation.
Sure.
But when you think about it, well, a white man did the attack.
Yeah.
And the white men are the ones leading religiously this idea that a white man could not have done the attack. That's also, I don't think you need an advanced humanities degree to kind of put two and two together there too.
No, and those same white men that are very quick to say that the Sandy Hook thing was a false flag attack, and exonerate, you know, the white guy that supposedly did it or not, are the same people that are, you know, spend a lot of time talking about Islam and talking a lot about the attacks that Islam and immigrants and other undesirable people of color, you know, crimes that they've committed. I mean, to the point where we're now, I mean, this really like goes up to the president in the sense of this idea, what's it called, voice, the idea that he wants to publicize the crimes of immigrants.
You're right. Okay. Yeah, that's right.
All right. Like that's
new
a program
program
that he, and to me that, I mean, it doesn't get more fascistic, racist, xenophobic, hateful, scary,
Yep.
dystopic, children of men-ish than that.
Totally.
And the idea that like we're going to have a megaphone basically from the federal government blaring, talking to us about the rapes and murders that illegal immigrants have supposedly committed in our midst. That, that's some of the darkest stuff that I've seen some of whatever I would call my alt-right people that are on Facebook that I see, that I guess are high school people that are still hanging around on my Facebook. The darkest stuff that they bring up, and I think I brought this up to you recently, is like talking about migrants and immigrants and refugees raping people and killing people. I mean, and you talk about a historical hysteria about people of color. I mean, I know you kind of traffic in a lot of that idea, and when you think about race in the 19th century, right?
Well, and I think the inverse of that goes back to the point we raised earlier, which is it can't be one of us. You know what I mean? So like the white male community, in some ways, cannot own its own crazy members, but it also points back up towards class rule. That look at Johnson, look at the Bush administration, and I'm not saying yes or no Gulf of Tonkin, or that, I guess that's kind of an easier one,
right?
Or yes or no 9/11. That's not the point. Not as a parenthetical. The worst thing any of us could do is to like passionately argue for one side or the other in an admitted false flag.
Right.
That's the New Yorker crowd, the PBS crowd, the NPR crowd. That's the last thing they want to hear. They want to hear calm voices talking kind of like this.
Yes.
So
the NPR voice. We're here today talking about false flag attacks. How are they used to enforce totalitarian measures at home and abroad?
That's pretty good.
Yeah. That's the NPR voice. And you're like, Jesus Christ.
So, but my point that I'm making is, to me, that the undercurrent of that racial politic, that racial gender politic, is again giving way to this class dynamic, this political incest idea. Because at the root of political incest, this idea that the government cannot cannibalize its own people. To me, the thing that's standing behind all of it is class rule. In other words, you have to admit there's this incredible inequality, there's this incredible hierarchy, and there's this incredible history, not just of enslavement and xenophobia and prisons, but there's also this history of like, dude, the people at the top eat the young. You know what I mean? And metaphorically, maybe not literally, except in certain, lynchings.
Yes.
But they eat they cannibalize the society at a minimum, figuratively.
Right.
And this idea that you're
in a lot of different complicated ways.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so what's interesting about the false flag in its falsity is that it gets at the underlying truth, which is if it's not that the government did or didn't do this thing, it's that that event that did or did not happen betrays a constant. And the constant is you're ruled by people and by a power and a set of powers, even powers that sometimes go to war against each other in a country. You're ruled by factions, you're ruled by these networks, and you don't have that much to say about it. And you don't know what they're going to do next, because you really are locked out of the rooms where the decisions are made. You only hear the things that they've decided on, except when things get leaked. And so this idea that there's this
and when you say you mean that you are referring to you as like ordinary Americans have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, what's really going on? Yeah. That's why I read the Financial Times. Is like, to me, if I can establish the pattern of mergers and acquisitions and how the regulatory apparatus does or does not react to those mergers and acquisitions, I can start to make better informed judgments about the future of politics than if I follow political news. To the extent that works, it does. Sometimes it doesn't. But like, that's the reason I do it.
Yeah.
And so to me, that's the truth of class rule, is that they are feeding off of us. They're the parasites. They're the parasitical class. They're the ones sucking everything towards the center. That's the 200 families that own 60% of the country. You know what I mean? That's the group that's pulling it all. And Trump's part of that group.
They benefit by, I think what I'm hearing from you is like, they benefit by just this false flag attack existing at all, in that it splits the reality.
That's right.
I mean, in the same way that race and gender and class and culture can be used as levers and drills to like split people up and maintain power for those 20 or 600 families, right?
That's right.
200 families, 200 families,
whatever
60%,
it is,
yeah,
you know,
whatever.
Whatever.
The capitalist scum fucks that run this country and run this planet, they benefit from us being in those multiple realities.
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, it doesn't matter who did 9/11. It matters that 9/11 happened and no one will ever know what it is. Like, I wonder if that's like something that's a lesson that whatever powers that be, and I don't think of them as like a monolithic conspiracy, but like I think of them as more like bugs that learn over time.
I think of them as competing networks of families.
Yeah, really. I mean, really.
Yeah.
You do see that in elections now. But like either way, that idea that they've learned since the Kennedy assassination that it wasn't the actual explosion of Kennedy's head and his death that's like really what moves history. What moves history is the idea that there are mega events that are unreadable, and they split up the electorate and they split up the population into separate realities, and that allows greater control.
Yeah.
That's a crazy idea, dude.
Yeah, and the two other things that say that is, one, the management of the ecosystem of realities, in other words, is a bipartisan project.
Yeah.
And
that's a bumper sticker right there.
Yeah, that's a real one.
Yeah, the management of the ecosystem of realities is a bipartisan project.
So in other words,
beautiful.
In other words, the left, no Democrat right now believes anything that Trump says, and 5 years ago, hardly any Republicans believed a word Obama said.
Yeah,
but that's actually the system maintaining itself.
That's a point that's come up before. I think Corey Robin from Brooklyn College brought this up on his Facebook, and it's something I may have brought up on the podcast before. So I'll say it again because I think it's important. But the idea that, like, for many presidential cycles now, half of the American electorate, or half of the American population, has viewed the president as an illegitimate alien of some kind that should be literally like arrested. When you think about George W. Bush and what liberals thought of George W. When you think about Bill Clinton and what conservatives thought of Bill Clinton, that he was a cocaine dealing psycho. Liberals then think George W. Bush is a illegitimate president that stole the election in Florida and stole the election of the Supreme Court. Then Obama comes and he's from Kenya and he's doesn't have a birth certificate, and the person who ran that program was Donald Trump, who now becomes president, and liberals now think Donald Trump should be arrested and illegitimate, and he shouldn't be there. So in other words, like you talk about that multiple reality thing. I mean, we're living in the swing of it on the macro scale with just presidents for decades now.
I would say
and
for the
it's
entire
crazy.
We'll go back to the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798.
Yeah,
I'd say that the idea that
it didn't start with Bush and Clinton. In other words, half the country didn't like Lincoln either, and you know what they did is they seceded from the Union.
Well, exactly,
and that began the Civil War.
I think this is political modernity, and that one of the singular features of this modernity is that it always thinks that what's happening now has never happened before.
Right.
But that's the only thing new that's taking place.
And that's why I'm a historian, Justin, and not any of these bullshit other academic disciplines that really try to analyze what's happening now. I know as a historian, because of my training, that that's fucking impossible, and that the only way to really know what's going on is to look back in time and figure out that there's a pattern to things, right? And that's my hard sell for the history discipline. It's the best I can do.
Well, I think that you should have the last word with that plug then.
Thanks, man.
Major in history.
False flags.
Yeah. But if we ever talk about it again, I want to talk about the labor movement in the 19th century, because I see a lot of the specific origins there.
I think we wrapped up the false flag topic. And I want to just say again, if I can remember your phrase, with the management of the ecosystems of reality is a bipartisan project. I love that idea, and I want to come back to it. And I know that we'll have you back, Justin, when we talk about 1877 and 19th century labor politics.
Molly Maguire.
I know you bring it up now.
Haymarket.
That's a whole other show. We'll come back for that. Thank you, Justin.
Peace.
Man, false flag attacks sure were crazy. Listening to this episode made me do a little research on Ancestry.com. As it turns out, my great-great-grandfather was one of the planes that flew into the Twin Towers. Am I right? I mean, come on. That's gold. For more hilarious and edgy jokes, please consider subscribing to the Nostalgia Trap at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap.